When I was thinking about developing the game and what the purpose of it was, I did a bit of research into different TTRPGs and systems and games that people are developing, and one of the first things that people talk about is the setting. What distinguishes their game from others in the market, and how the world that their game is set in promises a whole lot of different opportunities for adventures and interesting situations. One of the most common is that of a fantasy setting, the classic high fantasies such as Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder or Dungeon World or Shadowdark or Daggerheart or DC-20 or Draw Steel, etc, etc, etc. When I first talked to people about a Christian TTRPG, they would ask, is this like Dungeons & Dragons? And I would say, well, yes, kind of, except it's not a fantasy setting and there's no magic. And the result would be a very disappointed, oh. And I get that. After all, why would you want a game set in the modern world or anywhere else? That's so boring. I think one of the reasons for that is probably because with a fantasy setting, you can do anything you want. Everything's possible. A magic world means you can build in anything your imagination wants. And it doesn't even have to make sense. I mean, as long as you stick to some kind of rules so that you can take actions that have predictable and measurable results. I actually love fantasy. Fantasy and science fiction are my two favourite genres, and the majority of the novels and stories I read are one of those genres. So the reason this isn't fantasy is not because I think that that's somehow inherently bad. As Christians, we tend to have a relatively uneasy relationship with fantasy. On one hand, we love things like C.S. Lewis and Narnia because of the overt Christian allegory, and also things like Lord of the Rings because Tolkien was Catholic, even despite the fact that Lord of the Rings is actually very pagan, and Tolkien has said that it was not written as an allegory. But anything else seems to exist in this weird grey area, where at best fantasy is sort of treated like a fairy story with no real merit as far as literature goes, and at worst as a recruitment for Satanism. And by the way, I don't believe that Dungeons & Dragons was or is satanic. That is a total misconception that was made up by sensationalistic media. I don't have time to go into this here, but I can leave some links in the description discussing this further if you're interested. However, back to the game, one of the reasons why this isn't a magical setting is because I'm trying to make this as biblical as possible. And generally speaking, in the Bible, magic is frowned upon because it's seen as a counterfeit of actual divine authority. But there is such a thing as the spiritual world and the authority of God, including gifts of the Spirit and works of power and miracles and things like that. So this begs a very important question. In this game, we have a physical world, you can all see and touch, and we have an internal world, which is a mental and emotional world that is different for every person, but can still be affected in terms of things like influence or fear or sympathy or things like that. But we also have a spiritual world, which affects everything, not only the characters, but also the world around them. So the question is, how does the spiritual world work? Well, that's a great question. The Bible doesn't really explain everything about the spiritual world. It's not designed to be a textbook, after all. There are plenty of things about the spiritual world that we don't know, which is where theology comes in. But there are a few things we can extrapolate for the game and try and make happen in the system. The Bible does say a few things. So probably the first thing is that there are two things we talk about when we say spirit: the Spirit of God and the Spirit of man. The Spirit of God is generally indicated in the Bible with a capital S, Spirit, and usually means something like the Holy Spirit or the power or presence of God. For example, in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, it says, "The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters." And Genesis 6 verse 3, "And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days should be 120 years. So when God refers to himself, he often refers to his spirit, capital S. However, man also has a spirit, which is a small s. But when mankind fell and ate the fruit in the Garden of Eden, we became separated from God, and our spirit, which was once united to God's spirit directly, became disconnected and alienated from God. So while we still have a spirit inside us, it is generally regarded as being dead, and therefore we need to be born again through faith and through reconnection to the Holy Spirit. As a result, in the Bible it says things like, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." Ephesians 6 verse 12. We are trying to work together with God and with His Spirit to be a force for good in the world. So basically, when the Bible talks about the Spirit with a capital S, it's talking about the Spirit of God, which is essentially in and around and through and under everything. It's like there is this unseen sort of like field of energy that permeates the universe and that kind of gives mass to everything and creates actions and reactions between all the different particles. And it provides the first cause, the first movement in the cosmos, and the energy to provide motion. Now, I realise the way I'm talking about it right now sounds like kind of like the Force from Star Wars. It's all around us and everything. But it's different from that, mostly because the Force in Star Wars borrows a lot from Buddhist philosophy of the yin and yang, the good and the bad, the light and the dark. With God's Spirit, it's not something impersonal, but something very personal and sentient and responsive. But it's not something alien, because we are created from it. And there's no such thing as the dark side, the evil side. God's Spirit is all good, even though we don't understand it. And that's one of the key differences. So, how does it work in the game? Well, for one thing, the Spirit of God is not something we can control, but it is something that we can ask to be part of our actions. So a character will need to have not only physical and mental stats, but also spiritual stats as well that they can use and incorporate into their daily life. And there are also things like spiritual gifts in the Bible, like works of power that the believers use throughout the book of Acts. And right now, as believers in the last days, we can also use these gifts. So the characters in the game need to be able to as well. So things such as words of knowledge and wisdom, to know things they wouldn't know ordinarily, gifts of healing, of helps, of speaking other languages, and of course, obviously, working miracles. These are what the prophets in the Old Testament did, and what all believers are able to do in the New Testament. So these are the kinds of things we can incorporate into the game system. However, I am thinking about these spiritual gifts may need to be incorporated using a different system than a normal action for a character, because we don't control God. We are asking Him for His help and inviting Him in. The more experienced someone is with God, the better their relationship with Him, means the more willing they are to trust Him, and the more He will act with us. Not for us, but with us. So that's ideally what I'd like to do. It's not magic, but it is divine, supernatural ascendancy.